Hello guys and welcome back. Today's project, the Soviet KV-1 heavy tank version 1942 simplified turret from Trumpeter in 1:35 scale. It has been a while since I built a Soviet tank on this channel. The construction begins with the hull. First, I separate the two side parts from the sprue and sand them to fit and remove any protruding sprue gates with my hobby knife. These are then attached to the sides of the actual hull piece. It's quite a clever idea to combine the stability of a bathtub style hull with precise detailing on the sides using separate parts. Tamiya's extra thin cement is not really recommended for such large surface areas as it evaporates too quickly. Instead, the thicker glue with the white cap is better suited for creating a strong bond here. Correct placement is ensured using two locator pins on each side. While the glue sets, I will start working on the rear plate at the back of the hull. The parts all fit together well, and any holes will be covered up later by other parts. I almost made a mistake here though. I usually try to leave out clear parts whenever possible and attach them later. In this case, however, the clear part has to be installed beforehand. Otherwise, the cover would make it impossible to access it properly later on. The backplate can then be inserted into the hull. The little step at the bottom here must protrude slightly to ensure a correct positioning. On the hull, we continue with the bump stoppers. For anyone who has ever wondered exactly what these parts are, the bump stoppers are designed to prevent the suspension arms from damaging the tank's hull under extreme conditions. They do this by limiting and stopping their upward movement. They can actually be found on many tanks of different nations, depending on the suspension type. Before I attach the roof to the hull, I need to drill a few more holes. The relevant positions are mentioned only on the first page of the instructions, so keep that in mind if you are building this kit. If optional parts are to be installed, additional holes must be drilled accordingly. An additional armor plate is to be fitted here at the front to provide better frontal protection for the driver and machine gunner. Then I can join the lower hull and the roof. There are a few locator pins for this purpose. Here I am using the stronger, thicker glue again to reinforce the contact points, which are relatively small. Unfortunately, my roof piece seems to be slightly warped as it keeps popping up at the front. So I'm going to secure it with a few clamps and wait until the glue has set completely. The engine deck also has several locator pins. However, these don't really help. In fact, they actually hinder proper alignment. I am therefore removing them so I can install the plate with a precise fit. First, I tried it with just the two at the front removed, but in the end I had to cut away all of them. Tamiya extra thin cement is better here, as it flows much more easily into the narrow gaps between the panels. Here the brackets for the towing eyes are being attached to the front of the hull. Let's return to the suspension again. The axles for the return rollers are placed in their respective positions. It is interesting that there are 6 holes in the hull for the 6 rivets, even though the part itself has only 2 locator pins. Perhaps this is because parts from this kit are also used in other variants. The swing arms required a bit more cleanup work. First, the 2 large sprue gates need to be sanded down cleanly. Then there is a very prominent seam line running all the way around the swing arm. The easiest way to remove this is to carefully scrape it off with a hobby knife. Finally, clean everything up using a fine sanding sponge. This part will form the mounting for the idler wheel. On the actual real vehicle, this mechanism allows the position of the idler wheel to be adjusted in order to tension the track as needed. This component is designed to remain movable, so only the 2 mounting brackets need to be glued together. Though I don't quite understand why this needs to stay movable, given that the position is fixed and unchangeable once it is attached to the hull. Now I can attach all the swing arms as well. The exact positioning is ensured by the hexagonal shape of the 2 parts. This should ensure that all the arms end up at the same height. As you have already likely guessed, the entire suspension is rigid. Without modifications and aftermarket tracks, it cannot be built or displayed as a functional moving system. A small cap with 3 rivets is now fitted onto each swing arm for more details. There are also mounts for the towing eyes at the rear, but they simply don't fit. Either the holes are too small or the pins are too big, one or the other. That means cutting them off and just gluing them on without the pin. The turret ring is now being mounted onto the hull. Unfortunately, some large gaps have opened up at the front of the hull. The fit here wasn't quite as good as I had hoped, so I am going to fill the gaps layer by layer using a thin putty and then sand them down. For this, I'm using this solvent-based putty from Ammo, which dries quickly, though it has an incredibly strong odor. The KV-1 has 2 hatches at the rear here. I'm not entirely sure what their function is. I don't think they are for crew, the engine block would be in the way. They are probably meant for servicing and repairing the transmission. Theoretically, both hatches could be modeled open using an internal hinge, but then you'd just be looking into an empty tank, so it's better to keep them closed. Then there are 2 engine air vents here. Considering they are just plastic parts, the texture is surprisingly good, and photo-etched aftermarket parts aren't even strictly necessary for them. At the front, there is further armor reinforcement provided by this overlapping angled piece. For the front hatch, I'm adding a ring to slightly reduce the opening size, followed by the hatch itself. I initially considered leaving it open so I could place a figure inside later. However, I don't have a decent driver figure in my collection, and an open driver's hatch somewhat limits my diorama options, as it rules out scenarios where the hatch would need to be closed. In this case, I think it would make far more sense to design the parts to be movable, rather than making random, pointless suspension components articulated. The rod wheels consist of 2 halves with a poly cap in the middle. In my opinion, polycaps remain one of the best options for wheels, as they make assembly and disassembly for painting, for example, significantly easier. It is also really nice to build a vehicle that doesn't require 20 road wheels like the Tiger or Panther. Especially since there are no visible seam lines, this step was finished in just a few minutes. The drive sprocket has some really unpleasant flesh all around the teeth. It is best to carefully go around the whole sprocket and cut it clean. Then both halves can be glued together. Now for the cover, just a bit of fine tuning. I put both parts together and carefully sand them all around the disc. After that, it fits nicely onto the drive sprocket. The idler wheel has quite a bit of play during assembly, so make sure the two parts are aligned exactly opposite of each other and do not accidentally slip out of place. Now I can attach all the wheels to the vehicle. Unfortunately, however, the drive wheel and idler wheel didn't get any polycaps. Oddly enough, the idler wheel is very loose, whereas the drive sprocket has very little play. Neither situation is exactly ideal. The return rollers each consist of 3 parts. I'm going to glue them directly onto the axle to avoid having an excess number of small parts with it. I also have to mention the level of detail here, as it is truly impressive. The numerous holes, rivets and struts give the wheels a fantastic look that should really stand out once washes and weathering effects are applied. With the wheels in place, we can prepare the tracks. Included are classic link and length tracks, consisting of longer segments for the top and bottom, and single track links for the curved parts. What I really like is that the upper track section already features the track sack typical for Soviet tanks. That saves a lot of work compared to having to create that sack using individual track links. The only downside is the sheer number of ejector pin marks scattered all across the track parts. I've tried sanding them down as best as I can. We will see how the part looks later on with some paint on. Assembling link and length tracks is actually quite simple in my opinion. First, I put the relevant parts together without glue, following the sequence in the instructions. The parts here hold together quite well on their own, without the need for a jig. Then I lay the segment flat on my work surface and apply Tamiya extra thin cement all along the joints. It's fine to use a bit more here, we want a strong bond in the end. The glue can now set for a brief moment, allowing the segment to be lifted without falling apart, while still remaining flexible. Next, I place the upper section onto the return rollers, as shown, and carefully bend the flexible track around the drive sprocket. You may need to adjust the sprocket's rotation to ensure the teeth engage correctly with the track. Using slight pressure, carefully guide the track segment into the desired position. By this stage, the glue should be dry enough that it does not accidentally bond the track to the road wheels, and the tracks should remain as a separate component. I can use a bit of tape to temporarily attach the track to the tank for these subsequent steps. I'm going to keep the track in 2 sections on each side to make it easier to install and remove it. Now I will do the exact same thing at the front as I did at the back, carefully guiding the new segment around the idler wheel. However, aligning the 2 track halves so they fit together perfectly is somewhat tricky when the track isn't permanently connected. This isn't a problem though, as this type of track retains a good deal of flexibility even after painting and weathering, allowing for easy adjustments later on. Contrary to the instructions, however, I used one fewer individual link on both sides for the front section. The tracks should remain on the tank while the glue sets to ensure they maintain the correct position. In the meantime, we can proceed with the turret. Here too, a few holes need to be drilled if we want to use the optional parts. While dry fitting these parts, I noticed that the turret has several of these flame cut marks here at the bottom. I want to deepen them slightly with my hobby knife, so I am doing it now while the part is still separate and easier to handle. It is a simple effect that really helps make those details stand out more. Interestingly, the mounts that allow the turret to rotate later must be attached as separate parts. In most other kits, these are already molded directly onto the turret ring. Let's hope the glue holds well here. Now the underside can be joined to the rest of the turret, and the fit here was flawless. The gun in this model has no internal parts. That is fine though, there is only a single hatch anyway, and you can barely see through it. Since the gun needs to remain movable, I must not glue all the parts together. The gun mantlet is attached to the front of the turret here. If everything is done correctly, the gun should be able to move vertically. This cover goes on top. Here too I need to be careful not to accidentally glue the cover to the center section of the mantlet, otherwise you won't be able to move it anymore. By the way, the kit includes two different cannons, though unfortunately there is no specific information on exactly which ones they are. There is one large one and one smaller one. Naturally, I'm going with the large cannon. It's meant to look imposing and dangerous after all. Both barrels are molded as a single piece, which will save a lot of time sanding and skip the alignment work, especially since the barrels don't have a uniform thickness throughout. The gun barrel is then simply inserted into the front of the mantlet. Several optical units and sighting devices are mounted to the roof of the turret. There appear to be differences here depending on the version as well, but unfortunately there is once again no explanation regarding what distinguishes the various configurations from one another. The vision blocks around the turret are fitted with these thick, chunky protective housings. Visually, it makes a huge difference compared to the rather slender protective guards found on typical German tanks. There are even a few subtle weld seams indicated. Soviet heavy tanks often have a machine gun mounted on the rear of the turret. It consists of a few individual parts and a very delicate barrel. Let's see if I manage to snap it off while working on it. And that is why I drilled the holes for in the beginning. There is an additional armor plate on the turret on both sides. I thought that would make the otherwise rather bare sides look a bit more visually appealing. There is also a reinforcing strut beneath the turret, simply to add a bit more detail. I assume this armor here is to protect the turret ring. Two more holes, this time on the engine hatch. That round cover goes on here. The engine hatch is then glued onto the hull. These are the fenders that sit over the tracks. Each side comes as a single assembled piece. However, I want to shorten the fender on one side to depict past damages. In that case, however, a hole for the locator pins on the hull would remain visible. A good trick to close it off is simply to cut the pin of the fender and glue it into the hull. Then I saw through the fender at the desired spot. I'm now sanding the cut edges so thoroughly, as I want a clean edge. The individual fenders are connected to each other by bolts on the rear tank. Naturally, there should be no bolts left where the fender is missing. Therefore, I will first carefully cut them off with my hobby knife and mark their positions with a small dot. Using a Dremel, I can now drill small holes where the bolts would have been. A small detail, but one that will hopefully look nice in the end. I ended up doing the same thing randomly with a few other bolts on the intact fenders. I can easily imagine that those simply fell out over time due to damage. This allows me to make the tank look a bit older and more heavily used right away. The fender was, of course, attached to the tank in some way. According to my research, this was done using bolts, though the kit does not reflect this at all, and the struts simply sit against the hull, without any specific detailing. Nevertheless, I want to show the spots where the mounts were previously attached. To do this, I first mark the approximate location using the cut-off piece. Then I take my Dremel again and carefully drill 3 holes, one below the other, where the mounting studs used to be. I had actually planned to glue the fenders on now and slide the tracks in between later. Fortunately, I tested this beforehand and discovered that it wouldn't be possible to attach the tracks later if the fenders are already glued in place. That means both fenders will remain separate parts for now, and I will only glue them on after painting. Using a small pair of pliers, I now bend the corners of the fenders slightly to simulate further damage. The tape wrapped around the pliers simply prevents me from accidentally leaving the marks of the plier serrated jaws on the plastic parts. Unfortunately, plastic is more prone to breaking or tearing than, say, aftermarket metal parts, so I have to be careful not to apply too much force. I also must not bend it too much out of shape. After all, it still has to fit into the corresponding holes in the hull later on. These are the struts I mentioned earlier. Naturally, I have to glue them in place now, without the fender attached to the hull. Fortunately, they are relatively easy to slot on. There's also a machine gun at the front for defense against infantry. A very interesting feature is also visible on these parts. Ejector pins that are both raised and recessed simultaneously. This means I have to sand them down and fill them at the same time. Fortunately, none of this will be visible later on anyway. These are now being attached to the left and right, directly beneath the position of the turret. Here too I assume this is to protect the turret ring. And these hooks here will hold the tow ropes later. We also have a few spare track links, and they look really nicely detailed actually. Usually companies get a bit lazy with their spare tracks and just use the same ones as for the actual tracks, without providing the visible track pins. On the side here, there is also a box mounted on the fender. And yet another additional armor plate, this time for the lower hull. The kit also includes a few photo-etched parts, interestingly exclusively for the machine gun in the turret hatch. I will spare you the blurry footage and show you the finished gun right away. I think it looks pretty good and it can be mounted in the hatch however you like. So just to be safe, I'm going to set it aside as a separate part for now. A flexible copper cable is included for use as the tow rope. I always prefer this over the rigid plastic ropes, as I can place them however I want and make the whole thing look more individual. The whole thing needs to be cut to a length of about 71 mm according to the instructions, and for my American viewers that is actually about the height of one Big Mac. The tow eyes are then attached to the copper cables using superglue. I will leave the hatch on the turret open. There is a hinge for that needs to be glued inside the turret. I am basing this on the half-open hatch as shown on the box art. There are plenty of other spots on the turret and hull with flame cut marks too. I am going to carefully score them with my hobby knife now to accentuate the texture just like before. That was actually pretty hard on my fingers though, since the plastic is really tough and I had to apply quite a bit of pressure. I will use Tamiya's extra thin cement to smooth out the fresh cuts. The glue melts the plastic slightly, making the edges look less ragged. For the next step, I need some putty, as I am going to apply a rough steel texture to the surfaces. I will be using putty from AK Interactive for this. Using an old brush, I now stipple the putty onto the sides of the turret. Especially with Soviet vehicles, the surfaces were often very rough and uneven due to their mass production, a texture that is almost entirely absent from the plastic itself here. That is why this step is essential for me. I apply this texture to all the larger areas around the turret. The putty is acrylic based, so it dries relatively quickly. Once it has partially dried, I can further refine the texture by stippling it again. I will render different areas with varying degrees of coarseness, while leaving others untreated. These different surface textures allow me to introduce more variation and more clearly distinguish individual parts from one another. Smaller parts in particular can be given a coarser texture. This might not be 100% realistic for every single part, as I haven't verified exactly how the various components were manufactured in the factory. However, my primary goal here is to create variation and make the vehicle more interesting through a diverse range of textures. The putty needs a little time to cure completely. Afterward, I can carefully sand it down using various sanding sponges. If I didn't do this, I would be left with unrealistic, sharp points that wouldn't look true to scale. It is a matter of finding the right balance between visible textures and scale-appropriate irregularities. Using your finger is always a good way to check. Once I can no longer feel any protruding points, the surface is sufficiently uniform. It has been a long time since I made shell impact damage on the armor, and this is a great vehicle for that. First, I will use a suitable sized drill bit to create several impact marks on the armor. The scenario depicts a failed attack by a light German anti-tank gun, therefore none of the hits should actually penetrate the armor, only ricochets and non-penetrating impacts. To create ricochets, I will hold the drill bit at an angle and drag it across the armor. I'm trying to create a nice variety of hits. Some ricocheted off without penetrating deeply, others blasted off chunks of armor, and still others left direct impact craters. In terms of caliber, a 5 cm pack would be realistic, since it was nearly impossible for that caliber to penetrate the KV-1 from the front. And the corresponding high fire rate of such a small anti-tank gun explained why this KV-1 sustained so many hits, possible even from multiple guns. Next I need some putty again, but this time the Tamiya kind, which can be dissolved using Tamiya cement or airbrush cleaner. I take some putty and smear it into the holes I have just drilled. Using a blunt toothpick, I then manipulate the putty to look like metal displaced around the impact points. Depending on the hit and angle of fire, the resulting pattern varies. Head-on hits leave a small metal rim around the impact point, whereas ricochets or shots hitting at a sharp angle tend to push the material in the direction of the shot. For angled hits, I move the toothpick in the path the projectile would have taken to push the material in the correct direction. With a little extra thin cement, I can now smooth out the actual impact point slightly without altering the ragged edges. My kit also includes a bonus set of Soviet tank crew figures. I can easily picture two of them on the KV-1, one laying in the top hatch while the other stands on the tank itself. The figures aren't exactly breathtaking, their quality is very average. I am assembling them using thick consistency glue, as it helps fill small gaps and offers a bit more flexibility when positioning them. I think I actually used a figure from that set here on my T-34-85 a few years ago. The poses look quite nice and lifelike though, which could provide a great basis for a story in a future diorama. And with that, the build is complete. This is what the KV-1 and crew look like now, with all the parts temporarily assembled. I have to say, the KV-1 is actually larger than I initially expected, given how small the box was. All in all, it's a solid kit, even though you can tell the original mold is showing a bit of age after 20 years. Nevertheless, the details are nice and very satisfying for what is essentially an out-of-the-box build. I was able to assemble the whole thing in just over a weekend, so it is really a simple kit that doesn't present any major problems. In any case, I'm really looking forward to painting the whole thing soon and doing a bit of color modulation again. Do you happen to have any ideas for a potential camouflage pattern in case I decide not to go with a simple green? If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to never miss any future uploads. Any feedback or suggestions, let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching and see you next time.